I was watching on Hulu this week a new and entertaining series, Murders in the Building, starring Steve Martin, Martin Short, and, believe it or not, Selena Gomez. And I have to say, Selena did an admirable job working under two such great comedic and overpowering geniuses. So go Selena. The show is basically about a true crime podcast. And many times this resonates with me because when I'm working with an old book, I almost have in my head a true crime podcast going on where I have to explore different characters and clues and sew everything together to solve a mystery. So let me give you an example of a true crime podcast book. Now, this is a copy of Euclid's Elements of Geometry, probably the most influential book in the history of mathematics. And this particular copy was printed in London in the year 1661. Now, 1661 is a very special year because that is the year that Isaac Newton started his studies or started matriculating at Trinity College in Cambridge. And sure enough, it's recorded that the very first book that he actually purchased was this particular edition of Euclid's Elements. So I started to imagine, what a copy of Euclid's Elements that belonged to Newton would be worth. The very first mathematics book that he purchased that set him on such a great journey. And I can't even fathom how much that would go for at auction, with all of the plutocrats and the technocrats and the main Coons cats all bidding in a ferocious frenzy and drinking their Cristal and Dom Perignon. But I'm sure, it would certainly go north of $1 million there. And what is so tantalizing about this particular copy is, lo and behold, on the flyleaf, it says in a contemporary hand, a handwriting from the period, Isaac Newton, his book. So I have to go about solving the true crime podcast of, is this Isaac Newton's book? So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, who murdered Isaac Newton? Well, actually, Isaac Newton wasn't murdered. He didn't wake from his sleep. I think later they said he probably had mercury poisoning from all of his alchemical experiments. But regardless, I like to say who murdered Isaac Newton. But seriously, let's examine some of the characters in the plot. The first character to examine is Isaac Newton himself. Now, we can't delve into a long biography of Isaac Newton. Suffice to say that he was not the mathematical prodigy you would necessarily expect him to be. Of course, he showed a great aptitude for solving problems. One of the reasons that his parents enrolled him in Trinity College and didn't let him pursue the path that he was otherwise destined for, of being a yeoman farmer. And when he arrived in 1661, he went and he purchased a copy of Euclid's Elements, which he was very disappointed with because he found a lot of the propositions to be very obvious. And from there, he quickly excelled. So by 1665, 1666, when the college closed because of a plague, that sounds kind of familiar, and Newton had to retire quietly to work at home and probably order a lot of stuff from Williams and Sonoma and Crate and Barrel. He, at that time, made great progress. So he's only 24, 25 years old, something like that. And he was able to come up with the universal law of gravitation, the product of the masses divided by inversely proportional to the square of the distances, as every student of physics knows in in high school, of course. But this particular book really set him on the journey because he wasn't sure whether to pursue a career in mathematics or chemistry, but clearly mathematics won out, and Euclid helps him along on that journey. Character number 2, I would say, is Euclid himself. Now, Euclid was a great Greek mathematician about 300 BC from Alexandria. And as I said before, his book was incredibly influential, the most influential book in the history of mathematics. One of the things I like about Euclid's Elements outside of it being a mathematical text is it really was a blank canvas for innovation in the history of printing, because they had to basically show in visual terms a lot of these geometric representations, and this required advances in wood blocks and engraving and cutting, and some of these are quite complicated. All the way up until the 19th century, you find in 1847, for instance, there is a famous edition of Euclid by Oliver Burns, which is printed in color. And that is considered one of the great works in the 19th century of data visualization, so in the history of information technology. Another interesting thing about this particular edition is it is actually the first printing in English of Euclid's data. Data meaning datum, or that which is given. These were a set of geometrical propositions and derivations from them. But what I like about that is, of course, the use of the word data, which really is the first time it's seriously used and the basis of all our modern information technology, borrowing that particular term and probably transforming it. So that is Euclid. Character number 3 in our murder mystery plot, I would say, is John Dee. John Dee was the famous astrologer and astronomer to the court of Queen Elizabeth I. And he was so renowned in his day for his mathematics and his knowledge of geography and map making that actually an explorer for his expertise promised him all of Canada. Now, I have not even been promised a small studio apartment in New York for my expertise of bibliographical minutiae, but nevertheless, that is John Dee. And he wrote the preface to this very book. It was first printed, his preface, in 1570. And I would say of all of Dee's works, it's one of the most important and influential because mathematics during the period was not a well-developed field, and he really put it on the map. He considered all of human knowledge to rest on the foundations of arithmetic and geometry, and through his love of mathematics and his promotion of it, it really made advances into other practical fields beyond theoretical study. He even says here, a nice old black letter, as an example, all things from which the very first original being of things have been framed and made do appear to be formed by the reason of numbers, for this was the principal example or pattern in the mind of the Creator. So he really puts God's thoughts to be created or to be understood through mathematics. So that is John Dee. And if there is probably a final character in this plot, there's some other interesting people involved, but I would say it is the printer himself. This was printed by Richard and William Laybourne. William Laybourne is a fascinating 17th century English printer, well known for printing important scientific texts. He was also a very important surveyor, and a lot of his work after the Great Fire of 1666 in London, that wiped out a good portion of London. They used his surveying knowledge to help plan and rebuild the city. The fire actually destroyed a good portion of his stock, famously. He was printing, I think, a text at the time by Vincent Wing. But what I like most about Laybourne's printing is during this period in the 17th century in England, this was a period of very shoddy productions and poor workmanship, and you see these pamphlets and tracts very cheaply printed. But he really poured his heart and energy into the books that he printed. They may not have the elegance of some 16th and 17th French productions, but sure enough, he chose very beautiful woodcut initials and very exquisite headers for the books, and his diagrams were superb. So very fine typographical layout and the interplay of images and text for the period. So I like a lot of William Laybourne's printing. So now, before we continue on to Isaac Newton and the provenance of this book, we should talk a little bit about what happened actually to Isaac Newton's library, because for me, that is one of the most fascinating and amazing tales in the history of book discovery, I will say. The library actually was sold off after his death to John Huggins, who was a warden at Fleet Street, a notorious warden. And thereafter, in the 1750s, it went to Dr. James Musgrave. And Musgrave put his bookplate over the smaller Huggins bookplate in a lot of Newton's books. And there the books sat, believe it or not, relatively undisturbed until 1920, when a good portion of them were sold actually at auction, probably because I think the Musgrave family had some financial troubles, after the First World War. Booksellers quickly noticed that some of these books came from Isaac Newton's library and started to investigate the matter. And this is an interesting little account I wanted to read of some of the discovery. Colonel de Villamille, he says he wrote an account of the tragedy of Sir Isaac Newton's library in the Bookman, and this came to the attention of the Musgrave family, who invited him over to see some remaining books that had not sold at auction. He says here, I went expecting probably 15 or 20 books, but I found I could count at least 300 or 400, and I guess there might be 600. I've cataloged them, and I've actually found 860, which out of 1,896 is more than one would call a residue. All of these books had been stuck away in cupboards and corners where their owner did not even know of their existence. Otherwise, they probably would have been sold at Thames Park and lost. I've been in many libraries digging through cupboards and corners, but I can't imagine that I would ever encounter a library as great as one where every single book came from Isaac Newton's personal collection. What is remarkable about this is actually because a good portion were sold in 1920 and dispersed, you can to this day sometimes find an errant volume that belonged to Isaac Newton in the trade. Lo and behold, even very recently in one of our chat groups online, a professor, I think at the University of Colorado, found a book of optics that belonged to Isaac Newton, identified because of the Musgrave bookplate over the smaller Huggins bookplate. So they do very occasionally turn up. Now, there were some inventories made of Isaac Newton's books. There was, during the time contemporary to both Huggins and Musgrave, 2 lists made of books. But in the modern day, there is a bibliography, John Harrison, who really compiled all of the known works of Isaac Newton in a book called The Library of Isaac Newton. Very interesting to browse through just to understand the type of books Newton or any great scientist of the period would have gathered together. This book is unfortunately not in those lists, although there is a 1661 Euclid mentioned, but I could not find this exact copy. Now that doesn't mean it didn't belong to Isaac Newton. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the Musgrave or the Huggins bookplate, but I could imagine it would still possibly be a book that he bought early in his studies, as I said, and because he was so disappointed with the obviousness of Euclid, it never made it into his permanent library. Many times I've bought books and I have not kept them through the years. But let's go look at the signature. Now, Isaac Newton, his book, as I said, it's a contemporary hand, but unfortunately, it does not match any of the known Newton signatures of the period. Does not look like his handwriting. There are books he purchased that are known that say Isaac Newton, 1661, Trinity College, to compare them with. And this is much more of a careful calligraphic hand. Now, again, hope of hopes, I imagine that perhaps he bought this book as a student and it was his first book that he purchased, and he very carefully wrote his name in it, so that accounts for the difference in the handwriting. But unfortunately, it also says here, given him by his grandfather, which I purposely left off earlier for the purpose of tantalizing you. Isaac Newton's grandfathers, both on his father's side, Robert Newton, and his mother's side, Jane Ayscough, died, I think, in 1614 and 1620, respectively. So they could not have given him this book if it was indeed given him by his grandfather. Oddly enough, it looks like somebody has crossed off a little bit in an early hand grandfather, which is kind of peculiar, maybe given to him by somebody else. And here, however, is a particularly tantalizing detail. It says that this book in 1710 was purchased for 14 shillings from Joseph Button. Now, thanks to the glory of Google Books, Joseph Button is listed as a subscriber to some of Newton's works. So that is a delightful little detail. Again, because of how common certain surnames were, I don't know if that is the Joseph Button. And unfortunately, none of the other annotations, which were either written by Button or the person he purchased, who purchased the book from him, match Isaac Newton's hand. So I have really little to go off on, and because it indeed does not match his hand, and it says given to him by his grandfather, and I'm sure he did not wake from the grave to purchase him a book, I can only conclude that this is a different Isaac Newton of the period, and by sheer coincidence has written his name in the very first book that Isaac Newton bought at Trinity College. So unfortunately, that is a rather sad and depressing end to my true crime podcast, my study of Euclid's Elements and the murder of Isaac Newton. But regardless, it is a fascinating book from many aspects besides the provenance. So I hope you've enjoyed this little episode, and we'll tune in again for more fun and insights into the rare book world.